Hello all and welcome to Conversations on Leadership, a podcast by Academy Wales. Our guest for this episode is co-founder of Psych Safety, Tom Geraghty. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to be in.
Great. So to kick things off, it would be really great if you could just give a little bit more detail and background on yourself and what Psych Safety is.
So my background originally, I studied ecology and stuff at university, and I went into ecological research and so did that for a few years, a few places, and then through a roundabout sort of journey, ended up in technology. Started doing tech, and then started managing tech teams, software developers, engineers, and people like that, and became and remained really passionate about creating the conditions in which people and teams can thrive, and part of that was because at one point through that journey, I had a boss who definitely I think we could say exhibited the anti-patterns to psychological safety, if we could put it that way. But at the time, because I didn't know the term psychological safety, he would scream at people, blame people, rip people apart for making minor mistakes, and I knew, and we could see that resulted in bad things happening. That wasn't good for the people or the organization. And so I certainly knew that was the, in quotes, bad way of doing things. And it spurred me to find out what the good way was. What's the opposite of that? And that led me to discover the term psychological safety back in about 2014 or so, and I sort of became a bit of an evangelist about it, and began to talk about it at meetups and blog about it and things like that. And that is what led to the creation of psychsafety.com, which was originally a blog and is now a worldwide training consultancy business. And that's what we do for a living. I help people understand and foster psychological safety.
That's fantastic. And I'm pretty sure there's a lot of listeners who can empathize with your background, with your boss.
Mm-hmm.
But no, that's great. And I think that background will really help give some context to some of the questions that we'll cover later on. But before we do that, I'd like to kick off with just a few quick fire questions, if that's okay with you. What is your favorite noise?
My daughter laughing. I've got a 3-year-old daughter, and the sound of her giggling and laughing that's got to be,
So what would be your least favorite noise?
The one that comes to mind is the sort of unknown creak in the middle of the night when you're asleep that wakes you up.
I think that's fair. What other profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
So part of me has always wanted to be a surgeon of some kind. Probably like something to do with bones and things like that. But I and part of me still harbors some ambition that or some hope that I may retrain and do that one day. But so maybe that, yeah.
And opposite to that, then, what profession would you least like to attempt?
That's a really tough one to answer. But I think. I think fundamentally something incredibly hazardous and toxic would be pretty low down on my list.
So I noticed reading your biography that you mentioned that you love to travel. So what would be a favourite destination of yours?
We're incredibly lucky that we've travelled quite a lot, and I've spent a year or so travelling sort of out of work and doing that as well, and we're incredibly lucky to be able to do that. But what we're also incredibly lucky to travel for work, and one of the ones we did fairly recently was we did some work over in Canada around Alberta and British Columbia and that sort of area, and as a result we were able to spend a bit of extra time exploring the mountains and the glaciers, and went to Jasper and Canmore, and it was just such an amazing place. And we saw bears and elk, and just absolutely stunning part of the world.
Yeah. If we move on, then, you've written extensively about psychological safety. Why do you think it's such a critical component of effective leadership, and how can leaders foster it within their teams?
So this is a really good question. And I think there are two lenses for this, right? There are two lenses as to why psychological safety is important. One is One is sort of the utilitarian lens, which is fundamentally that for organizations, psychological safety, a presence of greater psychological safety helps us identify problems, highlight issues and concerns early on before they turn into big things. It helps us surface more ideas and different perspectives that can help us solve problems better, identify problems, innovate faster, and things like that. And it helps support the people within the organization. It generally, in almost every aspect, a greater sense of psychological safety helps organizations perform in whatever they're doing, whether you're a healthcare organization or finance or technology or manufacturing or whatever. Now that's important to know, right? And that's valuable. The other lens is sort of a more like a rights-based approach. We all, or at least I believe, that we all have the right to feel at least somewhat psychologically safe in the workplace. After all, we spend a lot of time there, and so we simply should feel safe to speak up with our concerns, ideas, mistakes, and suggestions. And this in the sense it's framed as a fundamental right to possess. There is no such thing. We're not going to reach this sort of incredible utopia of feeling completely, perfectly, psychologically safe all the time. That's going to happen. That's a fallacy. You're never going to get there. But we can always strive to be better, and we can always strive to make sure that we're creating an environment where everyone feels safe to contribute in the way that works for them. Because sometimes psychological safety is framed as only voice, only verbal, speaking up, in quotes, which is of course not true, because we speak up in lots of different ways. It might be writing something in an email or in a text, or it might be using sign language, or it might be, and this is important. It might be speaking in a different language to the dominant language of the group. We might, if I was working with a Spanish team, I can't articulate myself in Spanish as I can in English. So it might involve me speaking up in English and having someone interpret for me. It involves making sure that people feel safe to not mask their speech differences, like stutters or stammers or lisps or tics or accents. And in fact, this is it's like tangent, but it's important to know that in environments that are particularly psychologically safe, you may in fact hear more stuttering and stammering and speech differences than not, because people who have a stutter will feel more safe to not suppress it, to not mask it in psychologically safe environments. So I guess what we're saying there is, it's important because it's useful. It helps us achieve good outcomes for our organizations, but it's also we can also see it as a fundamental right of all of us in the workplace.
How does organizational culture influence effective leadership, and what steps can leaders take to create cultures of collaboration and innovation?
We all sort of interpret organizational culture to mean different things. Fundamentally, culture is sort of what we do and how we do it, and culture, organizational culture, is what the system rewards, punishes, and ignores. And as leaders, we can't define culture. We can create the conditions in which cultural practices and beliefs and things emerge, or at least the sorts of things emerge that we would prefer to happen. And so we often, it comes back to my sort of ecological background, we often use the term substrate to describe the foundation of culture. And culture is failure. So the substrate includes things like what gets managed, rewarded, audited, and punished. And so we need to think more about what are we rewarding and punishing, even unintentionally, or even almost invisibly. What sorts of behaviors are we encouraging and incentivizing? And this we often come across teams, for example, particularly sales teams, for example, who have sort of individualized metrics and scores and rewards. And And of course, what that tends to encourage is competition between team members. And so we people come to us saying, "Oh, we've got this team who aren't psychologically safe, who report not being psychologically safe," and then we would dive a bit deeper, and then we find that some of their incentives are actually encouraging the sorts of behaviours that encourage trying to compete with each other and playing zero-sum games where if I take a client off you, or if I win this project, or if I slow this person down in this project, it makes me look better because my project will get off going quicker. That sort of thing that we might not even realise that we're encouraging.
And what would you say are the most common mistakes leaders make when trying to implement these performances into the team?
One of the mistakes is trying to sort of say something like, "It's psychologically safe here. This is a psychologically safe environment," and you can't just say it, right? And in fact, to a degree, if you have to say it, it's probably not true, right? So we have to act it. We have to model it. We have to. Well, so there's a term called social proof. We have to demonstrate social proof that it is safe to admit your mistakes, raise concerns, suggest ideas. And of course, these are all different types of things to do. It's not just, encouraged safe to speak up. There are lots of different things that we might speak up with. And we often come across teams where it's safe to, for example, safe to suggest an idea, but not safe to ask a question, because there's a sort of internalized, unspoken, or even sometimes spoken out loud sense that you should know that by now. If someone asks, "What does the acronym mean?" or "How does that work?" I've come across it myself when leaders say something like, "Oh, you should know that by now." Like, well, and we have a page on our website where we created this 7 deadly sins of psychological safety, and responding with "you should know that by now" is one of the 7 deadly sins, because and this sort of shows how strong the observer effect is with psychological safety. If a manager responds with "you should know that by now," not only does the person who asks that question feel now much less psychologically safe, and they're not going to ask any further questions in the future, right? They don't want that to happen again. But everyone who observed that, everyone who saw that happen, feels less psychologically safe. To similar degrees, much less likely to ask those sorts of questions in the future. So so we have to be really careful to respond. So we have to respond well. We have to respond positively to questions and ideas and mistakes. And it matters not just to the person who we're responding to, but for all of those who might observe that. Even if we're taking meeting minutes, or it's been recorded and someone watches it or reads it later on, that's powerful too. So some of the pitfalls are not being immediately conscious of how much it matters how we respond as leaders. That fundamentally influences how psychologically safe people will feel and what we're likely to hear in the future.
And are there simple, kind of actionable ways that leaders can avoid those pitfalls?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. We like to distinguish between behaviors and practices, because changing behaviors for a leader it involves changing how we might do things. It might involve practicing how we respond when someone comes to us and says, "Oh, this project's running late," or "We've gone over budget," and instead of almost instinctively or unconsciously responding like, "Oh," and rolling our eyes and our shoulders sag, things like that. Actually practice pausing, taking a breath, and having an almost, this sounds like it's artificial, but having an almost scripted line of, "Thank you so much for telling me. That took some courage. Let's see what we can do about it together." And if you have that sort of ready to go as a response, then it gives you time to formulate a more detailed response and avoid the sort of more unconscious, instinctive response that may indicate it might not be we might not actually we might be very happy that they told us, but it's so instinctive that, and it's interpreted by people as plain, or at least with negative consequence. So that's behaviors that we can practice changing some of our responses, our behaviors. We can also implement practices, and one of those practices, for example, might be a social contract. And so with our teams, with our groups, because it's not just teams, it might be groups or others of working groups that we're working with, establishing and co-creating social contracts where we all agree these are the sorts of social norms and expectations and behaviors that we collectively agree to together. And that can be a really powerful way to help foster psychological safety and set some of the ground rules. And at least they're more like ground expectations for each other. And this is one of our foundational practices, because a lot of further practices kind of build on a social contract. It relies on having a social contract to begin with. And it's important to note that social contract should be a sort of living, breathing, evolving, co-created thing that changes over time.
If we look at particularly focusing on the public sector, some leaders within the public sector, often face uncertainty and rapid change. I mean, maybe now more than ever. What strategies would you recommend for maintaining trust and stability during those rapidly changing times?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and it's something that we encounter quite a lot. In fact, we have a lot of large public sector clients that uncertain. And the same goes for private sector and most organizations, in fact. But uncertainty is something we're dealing with all the time. One of the things to remember, I think, is that leadership. So there's a sticky belief, and I've spent many years in leadership roles, including C-level leadership roles, and I can empathize with this sticky, sometimes internalized belief that it's on us to provide certainty, to somehow make this uncertain world more certain and predictable. And of course we can't. At least we can't with any. If we did, it's just a fiction. We're lying to ourselves and to our team members. So the responsibility of leadership isn't providing certainty. It's providing coherence, direction, permission, and safety to learn and adapt through uncertainty, through uncertain times, and through complex, evolving situations, right? And this is what problem solving and learning is. So we need to create the conditions in which people can adapt as they see fit. They can. It's not about following processes and procedures and checklists, and machines can do that. People are the adaptable, resilient components of organizations. So it's about recognizing that it's the people doing the job that know best how to do the job, and providing the safety nets for them to embrace that uncertainty and adapt to it, and know that because it's uncertain, mistakes will be made. Mistakes are only mistakes in hindsight, right? But mistakes will be made. We're not going to be perfect. Not everything's going to go as well as we hoped, and some things are going to fail. But we can learn from everything. It's about creating an environment where everything is a learning opportunity. Everything is about learning. The outcome of work should be learning, not just delivering the thing, getting the thing done. It's about learning how to do it better next time, or learning how to improve.
It's fascinating because you've maybe just realized it's a very obvious point that the leaders can't control everything, but it's a point that maybe a lot of us do miss.
Yeah, and I think we as leaders, we internalize this pressure on ourselves quite a lot, and also as individual contributors and other managers and lots of folks in the organization, we can easily fall into this almost a trap of believing that it's the leader's responsibility. They should be providing certainty, and that's their role. And of course they can't. The world is uncertain, complex place.
If we look ahead, what skills or mindsets do you believe will define successful leaders over the next decade? And again, particularly focusing on the public sector.
So we did some work on this recently. Actually, we did a whole series of stuff called reflections, and we were sort of thinking about what the future holds. And if I'm optimistic, I think what we should see and what we hope to see in as more sort of leadership paradigms emerging is around embracing complexity, a further rejection of this sort of the seduction of simple answers to complex questions. That there is no silver bullet for everything, and the world is complex. We can't playbook our way out of every solution. So the this mindset of embracing complexity and adopting a more sort of sense-making approach rather than command control. So rather than directing and sort of puppeteering the organization, it's helping organizations and the people within it embrace complexity and make sense of the world and adapt and learn through the work. And that's quite scary for leadership, because that involves letting go, but actually this command and control paradigm that we've had for quite a long time only feels like being in control. You're not actually in control. So it involves letting go of this sense of control. We never really were in control to begin with. Another skill set, a very important skill set that there's at the core of a lot of our work, is about power literacy, understanding how power functions and is distributed within organizations. And we do a lot of work in this area, and there's lots of different types of power, from formal positional power to informal power to expert power, intersectional power, and they all exist in different ways and in different dimensions. And the most obvious one is formal power. Like that's how our sort of org charts are structured, and you can almost see the people with most power because they sit higher up and at the top. And it's looking suspiciously like a pyramid scheme. And I think it's like we could dive into this, but I think but for the listeners who are interested, the original org chart, the first ever org chart, had the leaders at the bottom of the org chart, not at the top, and it sort of spiraled out into this organic mycelium-looking structure. It was an org chart created by Daniel McCallum for the Erie Railroad Company, and it's a fascinating work of art as well as an org chart. It helps us reframe how we think about power in organizations, and so that's one of the images that I showed to a lot of leaders, and because the artifacts, the things we possess, the things we create in organizations influence the way we think, as well as the way we think influences those. So when we look at an org chart in an organization, that's how we believe power works. But it's not actually how power works in organizations. But power is so fundamental to how people function, and it's so fundamental to psychological safety too. Reducing visible power gradients is one of the most powerful things we can do to foster psychological safety.
I noted at the start of that answer there, you said if you were to be optimistic about these things. Yeah. How optimistic are you?
I'm optimistic that these sorts of approaches are gaining traction, and more people are adopting these sorts of approaches. But I'm also conscious that with AI and with increasing cost pressures and a more scary, polarized, pressurized world, that there is also there's also a pressure in the other direction to seek out the simple but wrong answers to how we lead and manage. We look back at Ford and Taylor back in the early 20th century, and there's sort of mechanistic positivist, reductionist sort of approaches to these scientific management sort of approaches. And they're still very, very strong forces today. They can work in the short term, but long term, we need more complexity informed, more humble approaches to leadership.
Well, thank you so much for those. Those have been fantastic and very thought-provoking. And I feel we could go on a lot longer there. But I think time is going to beat us. It's been fantastic. It's been very enjoyable. And I'm sure our listeners will feel the same. And I hope you've enjoyed the experience.
Oh, I really have. Yeah. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah, it's been brilliant.
Mae un podlediad sgwrsiau ar arweinyddiaeth ar gael trwy ein gwefan. Mae'r hawlfraint y podlediad yma yn cael ei gadw gan Llywodraeth Cymru. Our Conversations on Leadership podcast is available through our website. Copyright of this podcast is held by the Welsh Government.